this is a really good thing, and it shows that the secondary tariffs that Trump put on India might be working. But the U.S. has to be vigilant about keeping the pressure on India. There should both be the U.S. standing behind those tariffs and also the U.S. in dialogue, productive dialogue with the government of India to try to convince India to reduce its purchases of Russian oil. And note recently estimated that these collective measures against Russia's economy will likely cause Russia to lose 20 to 30% of its revenues. That's the type of significant change and damage to the Russian economy that's essential to get Russia to make concessions.
David, Baltic companies secretly refueling Russia's shadow fleet, reported by LRT. A network of fast bunkering companies operating in Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia specializing in vessel refueling is helping Russia's shadow fleet evade sanctions, according to an investigation by the Lithuanian public broadcaster. Simple question, why?
I guess for money. That's the only reason why. If you're from a Baltic country, most of the population in the Baltic states is supporting Ukraine, is very concerned and worried about Russia. Russia has engaged in provocations against the Baltic states and has talked about wanting to take territory from the Baltic states. So it's a huge mistake for these companies to be aiding and assisting Russia, and I hope the countries that they're from will prosecute them for violating the law.
Also, David, about Russian assets, very important topic. Leaders of northern European countries and the European Commission support a plan to use frozen Russian assets to finance Ukraine. The Guardian reports the proposal is to take these cash balances to give a loan to Ukraine that Ukraine has to pay back if Russia pays reparations. And therefore, it's legally a sound proposal, not trivial, but a sound proposal, says European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. What legal frameworks allowed the use of frozen Russian assets to provide financial support to Ukraine? And how would the proposed loan mechanism operate? And what conditions would govern repayment if Russia pays reparations?
Well, this has been an evolving policy. Remember, the US and EU countries froze Russian central bank assets that were within its jurisdiction and within its control right after the invasion in February 2022. And since then, there's been this discussion about whether or not to utilize those frozen assets. Normally, assets, when they belong to a government and they're frozen pursuant to sanctions, they aren't actually then taken. But there is some precedent for taking them, and the law was changed here in the US, and I believe also changed in the EU to make it easier to take them in this specific instance because of the violations of international law by Russia. Already, the US and EU have been using the interest on the frozen funds as collateral to make loans to Ukraine. And so this is a logical next step to make those assets even more available to support Ukraine. It's also really important, in my view, because as we switch from the Biden to Trump administration, the U.S. stopped providing significant funding to Ukraine. And so these Russian central bank assets, which are estimated to be around $300 billion, most of them in Europe, in banks in Europe, including particularly in Belgium, could make up the deficit from the U.S. not providing funding.
David, I see new information also about China. Chinese company is increasing imports of Russian oil to compensate for cancelled supplies after the UK imposed sanctions on the refinery, Reuters reports. The refinery, the newest in China, with a daily processing capacity of 400,000 barrels per day, is operating at over 90% capacity. What do you think about this?
I think that in the talk between Trump and President Xi, there needs to be a very fulsome conversation about China's support for Russia. And President Trump needs to find ways as part of these negotiations between the US and China over a number of different trade issues to provide incentives to China to not support Russia, to not have its companies buy as much Russian oil and gas as they are buying. And this is essential for harming Russia's economy.
David, and about Trump's visit, let's talk about this. During President Donald Trump's official visit to Tokyo, the Japanese government made an unusual diplomatic gesture to show respect and goodwill toward the American leader, according to the Associated Press. As part of the visit, 3 American-made vehicles were displayed outside the Akasaka Palace to impress Trump and emphasize support for U.S. manufacturing. What can you say about this visit, the results?
Well, this is kind of interesting. I mean, normally when a U.S. president visits a foreign country, there is some pomp and circumstance. And what I think countries have realized is that Trump really enjoys and is moved by these demonstrations of pomp and circumstance and a little bit of exposure to the culture. We saw when he landed in Malaysia, there were dancers dancing and singing traditional Malaysian songs. And so this is part of the recognition by foreign countries that to have a good meeting with President Trump, there are a lot of optics that help support him being in, feeling comfortable and feeling some affinity for the countries that he's visiting.